You call that a truck? Aren't you too old to be driving, Grandpa? A young man shouted through the window. The elderly driver didn't respond. He just adjusted his seatbelt and drove away. The next morning, as the convoy of 3 SUVs tried to leave town, 2 Humvees blocked their path. Marines stepped out. One of them said, "We don't let people talk that way to our former commander. What kind of man makes Marines show up just to defend his silence? Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened." Raymond Keene's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his 1984 Ford pickup truck with the familiar comfort that comes from decades behind the wheel. At 71, his body moved a bit slower than in his youth, but his mind remained sharp as ever. The truck, its silver paint chipped and faded, its engine occasionally protesting with it. After serving in the U.S. Marine Corps as a logistics specialist, Raymond had settled into civilian life with the same quiet discipline that had defined his military service. He lived in a modest mobile home on the outskirts of Riverdale, a small town where most people knew him simply as the reliable delivery guy. Raymond made his living transporting packages and occasionally fixing engines for neighbors who couldn't afford professional mechanics. Every morning at 5 a.m., Raymond would wake without an alarm, fold his blankets with military precision and prepare for the day with methodical efficiency. He never complained about early deliveries or late-night emergency repair calls. His neighbors often remarked that they could set their watches by Raymond's comings and goings. On this particular Tuesday, Raymond was making a long-haul delivery that required an overnight stop. As dusk approached, he pulled into the Hillside Gas and Market, a roadside service station where Interstate 40 passed near the small town of Oak Ridge Hollow. His truck needed fuel and his aging back needed a brief respite from the road. As Raymond eased his pickup beside the pumps, he noticed 3 gleaming black SUVs parked nearby, their polished exteriors reflecting the station's fluorescent lights. A group of young men in expensive outdoor gear lounged against their vehicles, sharing stories and laughing loudly. Weekend warriors returning from some adventure, Raymond surmised. After filling his tank, Raymond walked stiffly toward the station to pay. As he passed the group, one of the young men, perhaps 25, wearing a designer fleece jacket and sunglasses despite the fading light, nudged his companion. "Holy shit, look at that rust bucket," he said loudly. "Is that thing even street legal? Looks like it belongs in a museum, not on the highway." His friends laughed, emboldened by their numbers and the six-packs they'd clearly been enjoying. Another joined in, rapping his knuckles against Raymond's truck door as he passed. "Hey old-timer, retirement not working out? Or just too stubborn to stop driving before you kill someone?" Inside the store, the cashier, a young man barely out of his teens, looked down uncomfortably as Raymond approached the counter. An older woman waiting in line shook her head slightly but said nothing. The jeers from outside were clearly audible through the thin walls of the convenience store. "That'll be 43 cars, the cashier mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Raymond paid in cash, counting out exact change from a worn leather wallet. He nodded his thanks and walked back outside, his face betraying no emotion. The group had grown louder, their comments more pointed as Raymond approached his truck. They made exaggerated gestures of covering their ears as he started the engine, which coughed twice before settling into its familiar rumble. Raymond didn't acknowledge them. He simply checked his mirrors, secured his seatbelt, and put the truck in gear. As he slowly rolled past the group, he lowered his window just a few inches. "It's old. All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to them, "but it's carried things you couldn't imagine." Without waiting for a response, Raymond pulled onto the highway, the truck's taillights disappearing into the gathering darkness. Behind him, the young men exchanged glances and shrugs before returning to their conversation, already forgetting the old man and the ancient pickup. They had no way of knowing that their brief interaction would have consequences beyond anything they could anticipate. At the gas station counter, the young attendant leaned toward the owner, an older woman who had watched the entire scene unfold. "Miss Adler, that was Raymond Keene," he whispered. "My uncle served with him in Afghanistan," said Mr. Keene was something of a legend in their unit. Miss Adler nodded slowly. "Some people don't understand that age and quiet don't mean weakness. Sometimes it means you've seen enough that you don't need to prove anything to anyone. When everyone turns their back, only conscience remains." "Want to know what happened next?" As Raymond's truck disappeared down the highway, the young gas station attendant, Ethan Blake, couldn't shake his discomfort over what he'd witnessed. His uncle had told stories about a Marine transport driver who'd saved lives during a critical mission in Afghanistan, a man who now lived quietly in the region. "Miss Adler, I think those guys should know who they just disrespected," Ethan said. still watching the doorway. The older woman shook her head. Not your battle, Ethan. Mr. Keene clearly doesn't want attention, or he would have said something himself. Ethan reluctantly returned to his duties, but his mind kept returning to his uncle's story. From his station behind the counter, he could see the 3 SUVs parked outside, their owners now settling in at the attached diner for dinner and more drinks. Through the large windows, Ethan watched them recount the encounter with exaggerated gestures and laughter. One pantomimed an old man hunched over a steering wheel, while another pretended to fall asleep driving. Their table erupted in laughter that carried across the nearly empty restaurant. What the young men couldn't see from their table was the faded military ID card hanging from Raymond's rearview mirror, or the Marine Corps emblem discreetly affixed to his back window, small symbols of a life of service that had shaped him in ways invisible to casual observer. Raymond, meanwhile, had checked into the modest Pinwood Motel 3 miles down the highway. After arranging his few belongings with military precision, he sat on the edge of the bed and removed his wallet. From behind his driver's license, he extracted a worn photograph. 4 Marines standing before a transport truck in a dusty landscape, arms around each other's shoulders. Raymond's finger traced over the faces briefly before he returned the photo to its place and prepared for sleep. Back at Hillside Gas and Market, Ethan finished his shift at 10. The group of young men had finally paid their bill and returned to their SUVs, clearly intoxicated, but apparently planning to sleep in their vehicles before continuing their journey in the morning. As Ethan walked to his car, he overheard fragments of their conversation. That old dude's face when you knocked on his truck, priceless. Probably the most excitement he's had in decades. Should have told him we'd call an ambulance if his truck broke down. Ethan sat in his car for several minutes, engine off, wrestling with a decision. Finally he pulled out his phone and made a call. Uncle Mike? It's Ethan. Sorry to call so late, there's something I need to ask you about. The next morning dawned clear and cold over Oak Ridge Hollow. The 3 young men emerged from their SUVs, stretching and nursing mild hangover. After using the gas station restrooms and purchasing coffee and breakfast sandwiches, they prepared to continue their journey back to the city. Let's get moving, said Brandon, the apparent leader of the group. I've got meetings tomorrow I can't miss. They pulled out of the gas station in a small convoy, heading toward the interstate on-ramp. As they approached the first intersection, they were surprised to see 2 military Humvees blocking the road ahead. 6 Marines in full uniform stood beside the vehicles, their posture rigidly formal. What the hell, muttered Brandon, slowing his SUV to a stop. The others pulled up behind him. A Marine officer separated from the group and approached Brandon's window. The name on his uniform read, Captain Marcus Blake. Good morning, gentlemen, the officer said, his tone professionally neutral. I need to see identification from all 3 drivers who were at Hillside Gas and Market last evening. Confused and slightly alarmed, Brandon fumbled for his wallet. What's this about? We didn't do anything wrong. Identification please, Captain Blake repeated, his expression unchanged. Behind him, the Marines maintained their positions, faces impassive, but watchful. A small crowd had begun to gather, some locals who had noticed the unusual sight of military vehicles in their small town, others travelers who had been diverted by the roadblock. As Brandon handed over his license, a young girl broke away from her mother in the growing crowd and ran toward the scene. That's about Mr. Keene, she called out. He saved those soldiers who were trapped. Her mother quickly retrieved her, but the damage was done. Murmurs spread through the onlookers, and more people began to emerge from nearby shops and homes. Captain Blake examined each license carefully before addressing the 3 young men who were now visibly uncomfortable. Gentlemen, yesterday evening, you encountered a man driving a 1984 Ford pickup truck at the Hillside Gas and Market. During that encounter, you chose to mock and disrespect him based on his age and vehicle. Brandon shifted in his seat. Look, we were just having some fun, no harm done. Captain Blake's expression hardened slightly. The man you ridiculed is Raymond Keene, former staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. During his service, he was awarded the Bronze Star with Combat Distinguishing Device for Valor in Action. The captain paused, looking each man directly in the eyes before continuing. In 2004, Staff Sergeant Keene was driving a supply truck in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan when his convoy was ambushed. Despite heavy enemy fire, he drove his vehicle through the attack zone not once but 3 times to retrieve wounded Marines and vital communications equipment after other drivers refused to proceed. The crowd had grown larger now, completely silent as Captain Blake continued. 7 Marines, including myself, owe our lives to his actions that day.
He was wounded during the final extraction, but refused medical evacuation until all personnel were accounted for. Brandon and his friends sat in stunned silence. The previous night's mockery now hung between them like a physical presence, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Staff Sergeant Keene never sought recognition for his actions, Captain Blake continued. After his honorable discharge, he chose to live quietly, continuing to serve his community in his own way. He has never used his status as a decorated veteran for personal gain or special treatment. Captain Blake straightened, his military bearing becoming even more pronounced. I'm not here in any official capacity today. My unit and I are here as individual Marines who believe in honoring those who serve with distinction, especially when they are disrespected in our presence. As if on cue, a familiar 1984 Ford pickup truck approached the intersection from the opposite direction. Raymond Keene, unaware of the unfolding drama, slowed as he noticed the gathered crowd and military vehicles. There he is, someone in the crowd called out. That's Raymond Keene. Have you ever seen someone underestimated, who carried the weight of others' lives on their shoulders? Type respect if you still believe in honor. Raymond's truck came to a complete stop as he took in the unexpected scene. His weathered face registered confusion, then concern as he recognized the military vehicles. With deliberate movements, he put his truck in park and stepped out, standing tall despite his years. Captain Blake rendered a crisp salute as Raymond approached, a gesture of profound respect between Marines. After a moment's hesitation, Raymond returned it with the precision that comes from years of military discipline. Staff Sergeant Keene, Captain Blake said formally, "It's an honor to see you again, sir." "Captain," Raymond acknowledged, his voice quiet, but clear. "What's happening here? Is there trouble?" "No trouble, Staff Sergeant. Just setting the record straight about who you are and what you've done." Raymond's eyes moved from the captain to the young men in the SUVs, understanding dawning across his features. "This isn't necessary, Captain. Water under the bridge." "With respect, sir, I disagree," Blake replied. Then addressing the three young men who remained in their vehicles, he continued, "These gentlemen have something they'd like to say to you." Brandon, realizing what was expected, reluctantly stepped out of his SUV. His companions followed suit, eyes downcast. "Sir," Brandon began, the formality feeling strange on his tongue, "we want to apologize for our behavior yesterday. We were out of line and disrespectful." Raymond shook his head slightly. "You didn't know me. No harm done." "That's not the point, sir," Captain Blake interjected. "Respect isn't reserved for those whose achievements we're aware of. It's the default we owe to all, especially our elders." One of Brandon's friends stepped forward. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. If anyone treated him the way we treated you—" His voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Raymond studied them for a moment before responding. "When you get to my age, you learn which battles are worth fighting. That wasn't one of them." As this exchange unfolded, more townspeople had gathered, including several veterans who recognized the significance of what was happening. Someone had alerted local media, and a reporter from the Oak Ridge Hollow Gazette was now live streaming the event on the newspaper's social media page. Captain Blake addressed the crowd. "Many of you may not know this, but you have a hero living quietly among you." In 2004, Staff Sergeant Raymond Keene was serving as a transport driver in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. His actions during Operation Mountain Resolve saved numerous lives, including my own. The captain then recounted in greater detail what had happened that day, how a forward operating base had come under intense attack with several Marines trapped behind enemy lines. Multiple attempts at rescue had failed due to heavy fire on the only access road. Staff Sergeant Keene volunteered to drive the only remaining operational transport through that gauntlet, Blake explained. Despite explicit orders to wait for air support, he recognized that the wounded wouldn't survive that long. Raymond stood uncomfortably as his story was told, his eyes fixed on some distant point. He drove through an active firefight, loaded 7 wounded Marines and brought them to safety, Blake continued. When he learned that critical communications equipment had been left behind, he went back in. And when one Marine was still unaccounted for, he went in a third. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. On that final run, his vehicle took multiple hits. Staff Sergeant Keene sustained shrapnel wounds to his left side, but continued driving until reaching safety. He then refused medical evacuation until all rescued personnel had been treated. Captain Blake turned back to face Raymond directly. "Sir, we never properly thanked you. The mission was classified, the paperwork got lost in the system, and by the time the dust settled, you had already rotated back home and left the service." Raymond finally spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "I was just doing my job, Captain." Same as any Marine would have done. That's where you're wrong, sir, Blake replied. I was there. I saw other drivers refuse the mission. What you did was extraordinary, even by Marine Corps standards. At a signal from Captain Blake, another Marine stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box. He opened it to reveal a medal on a blue ribbon, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, with Combat V device. This should have been presented to you years ago, Blake explained. We've corrected that administrative oversight. On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, and the men whose lives you saved, I'm honored to finally present you with the recognition you earned. As Captain Blake pinned the medal to Raymond's flannel shirt, the gathered Marines snapped to attention and rendered a formal salute. The crowd, sensing the solemnity of the moment, fell completely silent. Brandon and his friends watched the ceremony with growing discomfort, the full weight of their disrespect now painfully apparent. Yesterday they had mocked a man they perceived as insignificant, only to discover he was the kind of person they could only aspire to become. After the medal presentation, the impromptu ceremony evolved into something more communal. Townspeople who had never known Raymond's history approached to shake his hand. Veterans in the crowd shared quiet words with him, the unique bond of those who have served evident in their interactions. A spontaneous gathering formed at the gas station where the incident had occurred. Adler, the owner, announced that coffee and breakfast would be on the house for everyone who wanted to hear more about their local hero. As people migrated to the gas station, Brandon approached Raymond once more. Sir, I don't know what to say except that I'm ashamed of how we acted, he said, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine contrition. We judged you based on your age and your truck, and we couldn't have been more wrong. Raymond studied the young man for a moment. You know what the hardest lesson I learned in the Marines was? Brandon shook his head. That character isn't about how you act when everyone's watching. It's about what you do when nobody is. Yesterday, you thought nobody who mattered was watching. I understand that now, sir, Brandon replied quietly. Good, Raymond said. Then something worthwhile came from all this fun. At the gas station, the gathering had taken on the atmosphere of an impromptu town hall. Captain Blake shared more details about Raymond's service, while locals who had known Raymond for years expressed amazement at the history he had kept to himself. The most touching moment came when a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, approached Raymond with a handmade card. My dad was a Marine too, the boy said. He told me real heroes don't need to talk about what they did. I never understood what he meant until today. Raymond accepted the card with the same solemnity he had shown when receiving his medal. Your dad sounds like a wise man, he told the boy. You hold on to that wisdom. By mid-afternoon, what had begun as a confrontation had transformed into a celebration of service and character. The event had spread beyond Oak Ridge Hollow through social media with the hashtag #respect, the quiet ones trending regionally. Local veterans groups announced plans for a more formal recognition ceremony. The town council proposed renaming a stretch of highway after Raymond, and Adler, seizing the moment, had a new sign installed above the gas station entrance, where a hero once stood silent. For his part, Raymond accepted these honors with characteristic humility. When finally given the microphone after numerous requests for a speech, he said simply, I appreciate all this attention, though I never sought it. The truth is, I'm no different from countless other veterans who did their job when called upon. Some received recognition, many did. The medal doesn't make the Marine, the willingness to serve does. He paused, looking out at the gathered faces. If you want to honor me, do it by remembering that the measure of a person isn't in how they look, or what they drive, or how loud they speak. It's in how they act when faced with the choice between what's easy and what's right. As the event wound down, Brandon and his friends prepared to continue their journey, thoroughly humbled by the day's events. Before leaving, Brandon approached Captain Blake. Sir, how did you know what happened last night? How did you find us? Blake gestured toward Ethan, the young gas station attendant. My nephew works here. After seeing how you treated Staff Sergeant Keene, he called me. I was already planning to visit this weekend, but I brought a few friends and came early. Brandon nodded slowly. I'm glad he did. We needed that lesson. We all do sometimes, Blake replied. The important thing is whether we learn from it. Have you ever witnessed someone being mocked only to have the entire community stand up for them? Comment with one word. Honor when agreed. If you believe good people are always seen. That night, Raymond sat on his porch as twilight settled over Oak Ridge Hollow, the medal still pinned to his shirt. He didn't feel like a hero, just a man who never stopped doing what needed to be done. But for the first time in decades, he realized that sometimes silence isn't about hiding, it's about waiting, waiting for a moment when the world is finally ready to listen. In the weeks that followed, life in Oak Ridge Hollow returned to its normal rhythm, but with subtle differences that rippled throughout the community. Raymond Keene still drove his aging Ford pickup, still delivered packages and fixed engines for neighbors in need. But now whenever he pulled into a gas station or local diner, people would stand a little straighter, sometimes offering a quiet nod or a simple thank you for your service. Raymond accepted these acknowledgments with grace, but never sought them out. His routine remained unchanged, rising maintaining his vehicle with meticulous care, helping where he could without being asked. It was as if the recognition, while appreciated, hadn't fundamentally altered his understanding of himself or his place in the world. The hillside gas and market became something of a local landmark. Adler hung a framed photograph of Raymond in his Marine dress uniform beside the register with a simple caption, "Where a hero once stood silent." Visitors would occasionally stop by, having heard the story through social media or veterans networks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the humble hero who had briefly gained national attention. The town's welcome sign was redesigned to include the phrase, "Home of Raymond Keene, Veteran and Honor," a change that Raymond had gently protested, but ultimately accepted when the mayor explained it wasn't just about him, but about what he represented. Ethan Blake, the young gas station attendant, whose call had set everything in motion, went on to join the Marine Corps himself. Before leaving for boot camp, he wrote an article for the local newspaper that was eventually picked up by national media outlets. "I witnessed firsthand how silence can be stronger than any shout." Mr. Keene didn't need to defend himself, because true strength doesn't require validation from others. It exists independently of recognition, rooted in actions rather than words. As Oak Ridge Hollow embraced its newfound identity as a town that honored quiet service, 3 philosophical reflections emerged that captured the essence of Raymond's story. Not everyone needs applause. Some people just need a road to travel, and a reason to keep their silence. Honor doesn't need to be worn on your chest. It lives in how you conduct yourself when no one is watching. Never underestimate someone simply because they choose to say nothing. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the weightiest words. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came not from any official ceremony or public recognition, but from the changed behavior of the community itself. A newfound attention to the quiet individuals, whose unassuming exteriors might conceal extraordinary stories of service and sacrifice. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Don't give up when you're doing what's right. What moment have you stood firm when the world stood against you? Share it now. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories to see that truth and justice ultimately prevail. Share this video with someone who needs faith in doing the right thing. We told their story, you gave it meaning. Thank you.